Welcome to the Greater Portland Council of Governments 2024 Housing Summit. I am just so excited to see this crowd here today. I want to thank you all for making it here on this not so springy day after a power outage. I appreciate all of you being here. I also want to thank the fantastic team at the Greater Portland Council of Governments. They not only put on this event, but they also launched a brand new resource for all of the municipalities that are here today, greatmaineneighborhoods.org. So this is the big day for all of those resources, toolkit and success stories and lots of other goodies for you on that website. I want to thank our members, the cities and towns here who are working so hard on the housing issue. And I also want to thank our speakers who are all leaders in housing and can inspire us to do more. How many of you are from municipalities, elected officials, staff, or on a committee? Raise your hands high. That's great. Today is really for you. The purpose of the Regional Summit is for you to learn from each other and inspire each other. If housing were easy, we'd have enough. But housing is hard and complicated. We face a shortage today that's been decades in the making, as you'll hear from Jeff Levine and Payne today. It's also hard because change is hard. We love our communities, and we're afraid that new development will make us lose what we treasure. There are lots of points of view to consider, particularly when a specific development is proposed. I think of a good housing meeting or a zoning meeting as kind of like a Thanksgiving dinner with family. Everyone has an opinion on how it should be done, but we all end up talking about parking. So jokes aside, even though housing is really hard, we need to welcome more homes in our region for all the people who need it, the seniors that are seeking to downsize, kids that want to come back to Maine to work and raise families, workers, including municipal employees like EMTs and teachers. This decade, we estimate that our region needs 24,000 new homes to address today's shortage and to meet tomorrow's workforce need. But more housing everywhere isn't the answer. Location matters. It really, really matters. In most places in our region, the easiest place to build, meaning the least amount of process and approvals, is on large lots in rural land. The hardest places are existing neighborhoods. In fact, many of the walkable villages and downtowns that we love in Maine could not be built under current rules. What I wish that all of us understood better is that when we say no to housing in existing neighborhoods, we're saying yes to housing in the natural areas, our farms, our forests, our fields, the places that make Maine so special. In Maine, we're fortunate that zoning rules are set by municipalities, giving local people the power to shape how their communities grow. What this means is that cities and towns have the tools to direct growth and to influence the design so the new housing can build on a neighborhood sense of place. Cities and suburbs can add vitality to their downtowns and their villages that are already served by infrastructure, they're near school, they're served by buses, trains, and ferries. And small towns can encourage gentle density by nestling housing into existing neighborhoods. Many of this region's cities and towns have already done a lot in the first 3 years of this decade to move us towards that target of 24,000 homes by 2030. Some of you might be surprised to know that Bridgeton is one of our region's superstars. Where's Bridgeton in the house? Yeah. They are punching way above their weight, producing more housing per capita than any other town in our region. They had more than 400 new homes permitted in the last few years, and 10% of it's affordable. Portland took LD 2003 and really ran with it. Westbrook permitted the most new housing in 2023 with 300 homes, and over half of them are affordable. Biddeford is steadily converting mills into homes, and Yarmouth has nestled new homes into the historic village, blending in beautifully if you've seen it. I also want to offer shout outs to South Portland and Scarborough. In South Portland, a large share of new homes are affordable. And in Scarborough, the governor and I were both holding shovels this fall at the groundbreaking for Scarborough Downs. There are more than 1,000 homes that have been permitted there in the last 3 years, and a real diversity of homes for our families and for our workers. And the style is a walkable neighborhood, and you have accessibility to trails and to open space. It's a really neat new New England village. Our region is doing a lot already, but collectively we need to average another 400 new homes each year 400 more homes since the amount that we've been doing in the last 3 years. So in other words, we need to do a little bit better than what we're doing right now, which is about 2,000 homes a year. And the leadership of cities and towns is absolutely essential to our region meeting its goals. We're here today to set the stage for more progress. We'll focus on what's working and lift up these successes. And we also have some new tools for you to take home. This morning, GPCOG launched a dashboard which shows how the region is doing against its goal, and it has specific information on many of your communities. We also have on our website success stories that are there to inspire us all, with Tom Bell, who developed some wonderful videos you should take a look at. And also a toolkit that is really geared towards boards of selectmen and town councils. So you can take a look and easily see what are the tools you're using and what might you still use in the future. So we've been doing a lot at the local level, and so is the state. And I am really, really glad to be able to welcome Governor Janet Mills to the podium. Governor Mills has been, yes, let's give her a round of applause. We'll give her two. We'll give her two. Governor Mills has been a driving force for more housing in Maine. Her 10-year economic development strategy for Maine, released in 2019, called out the need to add 75,000 people to our workforce by 2030. And her administration has been a housing leader in Augusta, prioritizing and funding numerous housing initiatives, including Housing First, which helps get people off the street and get the treatment they need, rural housing investment so that every city and town in our state can play a role in meeting these goals, and numerous other housing programs that are led by Maine Housing. Her interagency housing production needs study, which was published just this last fall, defined the challenge and opportunity facing our region and the entire state as we work to create 75,000 new homes statewide. We're grateful for the governor's leadership on housing, and we're absolutely delighted that she can be here with us today. So let's offer her a second round of applause.
Oh my gosh. I don't feel that tall. I don't know why, but thank you, Kristina. And thank you for organizing this incredible conference and this group today, all eager to talk about housing needs of Maine. And I just want to catch up and talk about some things my administration has done. Work is never finished, of course, but we know that the lack of affordable housing has profound impacts on everything from our state's economy, workforce recruitment, worker retention, and I'm pleased to be here to be part of the conversation, this important conversation that you're having today about how to grow vibrant communities in southern Maine, avoiding sprawl, avoiding taking away our beautiful natural resources and fields and areas for recreation, but also accommodating the needs of people from large businesses to small, schools, families, the needs of our people to have safe, affordable shelters and housing. Let's start with some good news. By focusing our efforts on improving high-speed internet and good schools and safe communities and good paying jobs and a clean environment, this administration, I believe, has been attracting new families to our state and strengthening our economy. Since the end of 2019, Maine's GDP, gross domestic product, has increased by 9.2%, the best rate of growth in New England and one of the highest in the nation. Yeah. Yay, GDP. From 2020 to 2023, our population grew by 2.4%. I know that sounds like a small number, but I'm waiting for the day, any day now, when I can announce that Maine's population is 1.4 instead of 1.395. But our population growth has been twice the national rate and 8 times the rate of population growth in New England. I know when I was a child growing up in Maine, the brain drain was the theme, and everybody said, oh, you're going to leave Maine, never come back, and a lot of my classmates did just that. But now, people are coming back. They see Maine as a safe, comfortable place to be and to work and raise a family. And through October of last year, more than 15,000 new businesses filed to begin operations in Maine, 1,000 more than the same period in 2022. New businesses, new families, new people. Our economy is strong, and it's getting stronger every day. But you and I both know that the biggest impediment to our economic growth is the lack of affordable housing for our growing workforce in particular. Bath Iron Works, Washburn and Doughty, Bigelow Lab in East Boothbay, Jackson Labs in Bar Harbor, they've all had a hard time hiring workers because employees can't find affordable housing. Some businesses are having to build their own workforce housing. If you go up to Saddleback, you'll see this beautiful new dorm. I mean, that was partly privately funded, and it's a great idea. Other businesses are having to do that too. Find places for their people to stay. Like big dorms and apartment houses. I hear every day from people across the state of Maine about the challenges of housing, which is why this administration has worked with Maine Housing to determine the root causes of our housing shortage and to identify and address our housing needs. The report we jointly released last year shows that our state as a whole needs an estimated 84,000 homes and apartments, housing units by 2030, based on current economic and population trends. Now, we're not alone. The entire country is looking at about 3.8 million units of housing that we need, rent or for sale, in part because new housing construction slowed after the Great Recession. Why do they call it a Great Recession? It was a terrible time. The recession of 2008 and 9, and it never truly rebounded. That shortage, historic shortage, along with high interest rates right now, labor and supply chain issues in the last few years, have put safe, affordable housing out of reach for too many people, and contributing to homelessness and leading to many young families and young people having to put their hard-earned money towards rent instead of mortgage and building equity in their residence. Well, while the problem is not unique to Maine, it is national. At least we here in Maine are doing something about it. In the short term, we're working with municipal and private organizations on emergency housing to keep people from sleeping on the streets, especially during cold winter months, and reducing pressure on local budgets. To that end, my administration and the legislature created the Emergency Housing Relief Fund. Our previous $55 million investment in the fund is supporting more than 70 housing programs and 7,000 Maine people in need statewide. In the greater Portland area alone, that funding has resulted in new shelter beds for 450 people, transitional housing for 800 people, and permanent housing for 700 people. This is progress. In my supplemental budget, currently being heard by the Appropriations Committee, I proposed an additional $16 million for the Emergency Housing Relief Fund to make sure we continue to meet the emergency housing needs of Maine people and communities, including low-barrier shelters, 3 of which are located right here in Portland. In the long term, we focused on building permanent, affordable, and energy-efficient housing for people, and we're doing that in 2 primary ways. First, we're strengthening the Housing First program to address people's needs, those who are experiencing chronic homelessness, many of whom are also dealing with acute mental illness or substance use disorder. In my previous budget, I included funding to expand the number of Housing First units with on-site wraparound services from 85 to about 500 statewide. There are now 3 Housing First programs right here in Portland: Houston Commons, Florence House, and Logan Place, with other sites under development. Look, Housing First is a successful and cost-effective way to address chronic homelessness for people like Sarah, a domestic violence survivor who's been chronically unhoused for the past 22 years, who said that moving into a Housing First property in Portland saved her life. At the same time, we're building our housing inventory, an action that will increase supply and reduce prices and result in good homes for Maine people. What else have we done? Well, one of the very first actions I took as governor 5 years ago was to release the senior housing bond that had been held up for several years by my predecessor. and which had been overwhelmingly approved by Maine voters in 2015. So far, that bond alone has funded the construction of more than 400 more units of affordable housing for seniors. And I visited some of those housing units in this area, and they are beautiful. When seniors move into those housing units, they oftentimes give up their homes, sell their homes in the communities, which increases the inventory of housing for young families. I also signed legislation to allow Maine property owners to build accessory dwelling units. I know that wasn't an easy sell, but it's one way to increase the inventory without encouraging sprawl, too. That change alone is creating more housing at the same time, and it's generating income for homeowners who rent out their units so they don't feel pressured to sell. I signed legislation as well to extend the Maine Historic Rehabilitation Tax Credit, and that is a huge thing. I think that has encouraged financing projects such as redevelopment of Lewiston's Continental Mill. They're making 72 apartments out of that mill building. And it's a great example of how historic buildings in our state can be reborn as housing for future generations. Again, keeping people downtown more or less and limiting sprawl, because we do have this sense of place that we value as Maine people, what attracts people here in the first place and brings people back. I also signed legislation to create the Maine Affordable Housing Tax Credit, the single largest investment in housing in Maine history. That program already has been used to preserve and build hundreds of affordable rental units from Portland to Lewiston to Freiburg to Skowhegan and places across the state. And I signed legislation to create the Affordable Home Ownership Program and the rural, say this fast, 10 times fast, the Rural Affordable Rental Housing Program. Rural affordable rental housing through Maine Housing. I'm going to rename it. To incentivize private developers to build affordable homes for people to purchase and to rent. So the Affordable Home Ownership Program already has 180 homes in the pipeline. And in the supplemental budget, pending right now, I've proposed $10 million to bolster this program and in order to construct another 130 affordable units statewide. Separately, the Rural Rental Program has funded 106 new units of rental housing in rural communities across the state. Last October, I attended a groundbreaking for one of those projects in Madison. It's one that'll create 18 affordable apartments in downtown Madison. With Timber HP, or Go Labs, expanding their operations and hiring as many as 120 people just down the road from that those housing units at the former Madison Mill site, this housing project couldn't come at a better time. Last week, I was also pleased to sign legislation, LD 2209, to authorize Maine Housing to issue more bonds to finance affordable rental housing and mortgages for first-time home buyers in cities and rural communities for years to come. Thanks to this new law and a portion of the new funding provided in the biennial budget, I'm pleased to announce today that construction will start very soon on 105 new affordable rental units in Hollowell, Newcastle, Rockport, Rumford, Sanford, and Waterville. Taken all together, my administration has authorized nearly $285 million in support to help the construction of more apartments and homes across Maine. These state and federal funds have resulted in more than 600 new residential units so far, with more than 1,000 units under construction right now, and more than 2,000 units in the pipeline. That's the highest number ever in Maine housing's history. So I'm proud of the progress we've made, but I know that municipalities need support as they navigate these new opportunities for housing development. The Housing Opportunity Program at DECD, Department of Economic and Community Development, can provide you with funding and technical assistance. I encourage community leaders to email housing.decd@maine.gov. You got this right. For more information about the support that's available to you in this area. In the coming weeks, my administration will also launch a new housing data portal, like hers, to support housing development across the state. And I ask community leaders here today to help us advance this work by sharing information about the housing units that have been created in your community. What are your needs? What are your goals? What are your actions? Things that will help us document trends and identify where gaps exist and target resources effectively. I read something recently that said, home wasn't built in a day. Well, I agree. Ultimately, we all want to provide and build permanent, affordable, comfortable housing, weather-resistant housing for all who need it and all who want to be in Maine. To do that, we've got to think outside the box, no matter where you are. We can turn vacant office buildings into apartments, stores, restaurants, multi-purpose facilities, things that bring new life to downtowns. We can turn old schoolhouses and even courthouses into smaller, more manageable apartments for seniors to live in safely in the communities that they love. We can create apartment complexes with shared kitchens and other amenities so more single people and young couples working in Maine can find a nice place to live without paying an expensive monthly rent or mortgage. Adapting existing structures and doing long-term planning that it takes to create more comfortable, efficient, and affordable housing that also avoids sprawl and preserves that sense of place and that sense of community. That's one of the special things about Maine. That's what brings people to Maine and keeps young people here, wanting to stay here. We're engaged in that planning with so many dedicated partners, including many of you here today. We have to constantly assess the progress we're making and determine the best ways to target the resources we have to build more affordable housing in our state. And I just want to thank you for everything you're doing. And for the towns and people in the towns who question why there should be new projects in their neighborhoods, there is nothing to fear. We are all in this together. The whole state needs you to do your part too. We have got to work on this together. And I look forward to the time when we can tell every person who wants to live and work in Maine or wants to stay here, welcome home. Thank you. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you so much. Governor Mills, I just want to thank you so much for everything that your administration has done to pour the resources into this housing shortage and try to figure out a good way forward. There have been the housing first developments, the rural housing. There's been a lot of new units, as you heard, that have been created through those resources. And then I also want to just do a little underscore on the Housing Opportunities Program, which the governor just mentioned. That's a new technical assistance fund that was set up about last year and just became operational this fall. I know GPCOG is working with several of you through that to help you identify ways that will make it easier for you to welcome housing and ways that make sense and locations that work for people that need it. And then also you can get direct technical assistance funding also through the Housing Opportunities Program. So we've got resources and we've also got zoning tools to try to make the market work as best it can along with public subsidy. So we're so grateful for the state's partnership on this. It's been really a terrific and very fast moving program that's been going on. So with that, I would like to welcome to the stage the president of the Greater Portland Council of Governments, Jarrod Maxfield. Jarrod is a friend. He's been working with GPCOG GPCOG for a long time, and he's been on the Windham Council for a long time, really helping to steer Windham, which is a rapidly growing community, through a very difficult period of growth and very exciting period of growth as we start to look at North Windham for all the possibilities that North Windham has. So, Jarrod, thank you for being a leader on growth. Thank you for being a leader of our organization. Please come to the stage.
I'm going to use the box. No. Thank you, Kristina. Thank you, Governor Mills. You are both two tough acts to follow, that's for sure. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today as we engage and exchange ideas on a critical challenge facing our state, our region, our communities, which is housing. My name is Jarrod Maxfield. I'm a Windham Town Councilor since 2016 and the current volunteer president of GPCOG. I'd like to share a few thoughts on why housing matters and what I hope we can all take from today's program, because it's imperative that we as elected officials, community and business leaders learn what we can so that we can help grow our housing opportunities for everybody. As I look around the room, we're a mixed group of folks. We have professionals, volunteers, political leaders, and more. People who strive daily to make the lives for those we serve better. But in reality, we're also just kind of modern day cavemen still. We need the basics that people have needed since the beginning of time. Love, food, shelter. When we think of shelter, we might think of a roof, walls, protection from the elements, but it's really so much more. It's a key factor in our health, safety, psychological well-being, socioeconomic stability, community, belonging, cultural identity, and so much more. It's a foundation. It's a foundation that every person in Maine deserves a fair opportunity to earn and benefit from. Too often these days, the knee-jerk reaction to creating new housing opportunities is rejection. Housing growth is often characterized as an assault on the current status quo, the environment, our tax base, our communities, while ignoring the benefits that it brings, such as economic growth, affordability, and expansion of the community members who make up the fabrics of our thriving cities and towns. For decades, we've spoken about, as the governor just mentioned, the brain drain. Young people move from our state, or the so-called silver tsunami, as our state literally has more deaths than births every year. Over the last few years, that trend has started to shift a bit, and we've started to attract more people from away. That's what we say here in Maine, from away. Where'd you folks come from? But it's been a benefit to bring in new folks, but it's also been somewhat of a curse because it's exasperated our home prices, and it has exasperated our home prices, and whether you're renting or owning, it's affected the supply as the demand is far outweighing it. We must find a way to balance and increase housing opportunities that will help Maine continue to be a prosperous state. An important way to make this happen is to work with our residents, highlighting the benefits of new housing while also respecting their concerns. I'd like to share a story that happened to us recently in Windham. We've had great success in getting a new senior affordable housing project off the ground. A local church needed to sell some land in order to raise funds so they could do some much needed work on their place of worship. They found an opportunity to work with the Developers Collaborative on creating a new affordable senior housing project. This project is in an area that's already experienced recent growth. It borders an existing community, and it's near water bodies. The current residents, of course, had concerns about the growth, about the character of their neighborhood, about the environment of those water bodies. So our plan as a council and a staff was not to shy away or avoid those concerns, but to meet them head on and to meet with those folks and address those concerns and tell them how this type of housing project will not only benefit Windham, but their local community there. A project like this compared to a market rate project actually creates less density, less traffic, greater setbacks, more environmental protection for those waters, and also brings in new neighbors who are going to enhance the fabric of that community. Many of those folks who would want to move to an affordable senior project are not from away. They're going to be current Wyndham residents who want to stay in the town they love, but now lack the affordable options that a project like this will bring. And working with us folks and working with that community, we found, with facts in hand, support. We then, as a staff and a council, put our money where our mouth is and created a TIF district for that project to ensure it can move forward and be a benefit to everybody. That is a success we saw in Wyndham that we hope to see again, and I hope truly to see in many of your communities as we all move forward with this, tackling this issue. As it's been mentioned, growth is always going to come, no matter what, but we have a chance through planning and partnership to make sure that it's smart growth and that it works for our state, our region, and our communities. We have to remember that most of us who sit in this room are constantly and consistently deep in this information, today being the perfect example. We're talking about housing, and we're going to talk a lot about it and be very in-depth. But those who we serve have busy lives, and they are not privy to all the information that we get to immerse ourselves in. It's important for us to keep them informed and to share that information, because in a vacuum of not sharing positive information, we all know it will be filled with negatives and false information. Change is hard, it's scary, but it's also a blessing and an opportunity. And it's our job to keep our foot on the gas, to work with our residents, to find those positives, and create the housing that we so desperately need. So, as we go through today's sessions, I hope you all enjoy it. I hope we listen, we learn, and we keep in mind the responsibility in our roles to make sure we bring that information back to our communities, find partners in our residents, and make sure that they know what we all know, that housing matters. And as simple as that, let's get started. So I've got some great panelists coming up to get us started. We're lucky to have 3 of our Housing Summit partners here today. I'm going to introduce them and ask them to each outline why housing is critical to our economy, our environment, and our region's equity. Quincy Hentzel is the president and CEO of the Portland Regional Chamber of Commerce. Her organization has been a leading advocate of regional housing growth in support of a stronger economy, both today and in the future. Cotter Schlax is the president and CEO of United Way of Southern Maine. Liz and her team are regional leaders seeking to improve equity in our region through more attainable housing, better public health, and stronger educational opportunities. And Rebeccah Sanders is CEO of the Natural Resources Council of Maine. NRCM is committed to balancing housing growth with sustainability and the protection of open space and the environment. Clearly, some core Maine values that are very important to protect. I'd like to thank you all for being here, welcome you to the stage, and Quincy, if you don't mind, we're going to ask you to kick it off. So enjoy the session today, everybody.
A huge thank you to Kristina and GPCOG for pulling this summit together and for inviting me with the Portland Regional Chamber and my colleagues, Liz and Rebeccah, up to the stage to kick it off, to talk about, or to provide a little context as to why we're here and why the topic of housing is so important. I think the governor, I could probably say ditto to the governor's remarks. She actually said a lot of the things I was going to say, but maybe I'll try to add a little color and just say that the reason the Portland Regional Chamber is here is because of workforce development. And I think the governor made that incredibly clear. I've been with our chamber in one capacity or another for probably the last 16 or 17 years. And we always have a list of policy priorities, and for as long as I can remember, our number one policy priority was workforce development. We absolutely need to attract and to retain workers to the greater Portland region, or we will just die as a region and our economy will dry up. Over the last couple of years, we have noticed a very sizable shift in our policy priorities. Workforce development is still absolutely our number one goal, but we have discovered barriers, pretty significant barriers to workforce development, the number one barrier being housing, which is why we're here. I would say the number 2 barrier is probably childcare. As my friend Liz and I have had many, many conversations, that could be a totally different summit. But those have become two of the biggest barriers to attracting and to retaining workers. We don't have enough housing, it's not affordable, they can't live in the region, and therefore we're just not hitting those numbers that we need to hit. So all of a sudden, housing has just leapfrogged to the number one thing we talk about at the Chamber. It is housing, 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 all day, every day. So that is why I'm here. And it's why the Chamber is so invested in this work and so invested in increasing our housing supply, because if we cannot attract workers, we are just going to be in a crisis, basically. I think both Kristina and the governor mentioned these numbers, but I think they're worth repeating. And that is, Maine needs to build upwards of 84,000 homes by 2030. In that same time frame, we also have to add 75,000 workers to our workforce, and it's no coincidence that those numbers are very closely aligned. We have a demographic cliff. I hate saying that, it's overused, but it's very, very true. We have a whole host of individuals in Maine who are getting ready to retire, and that's fantastic. That's so great for them. One data point we're finding with individuals who are retiring is that they are not leaving Maine. So they're retiring and they're deciding to age in place in Maine, which is also fantastic. Maine's a great place to live, and that's proven by the fact that we're all here and nobody wants to leave. But what's happening is we're seeing our workforce turnover, but we're not seeing our housing stock turnover. So people are leaving the workforce, they're retiring, but they're not leaving their homes. So we have this added complication to our need for housing and the need for workers. They're totally tied and directly related. And the fact that people are staying here, where it's great, it's also a little bit of a complicating factor. I think Kristina mentioned this earlier, and thanks to GPCOG, we know that our region needs 24,000 housing units by 2030. One of the challenges we have with that is that 85% of the land in our region does not allow multifamily construction, or they have significant limitations. So if you think about that, we need 24,000 units, but we have a very small swath of land where we can build them. So part of what we need to do collectively is figure out how we remove those regulatory barriers so we can actually build the housing that we need. I know the governor spoke a little bit about this, but recently we have been looking at state level initiatives. I know all of you have as well. Last year we had LD 2003 that passed, which was probably the state's first effort to really look at housing policy, which just shows the level that the level of this crisis that we're in around lack of housing across the state. And we at the Chamber have been very supportive of this as well for several reasons. We have seen municipalities recently vote down housing projects. I think Cumberland is the most recent example, which earlier this month, Cumberland voters soundly rejected a project that would have added 170 units to their town center. Cape Elizabeth, another example of a municipality that after a very lengthy municipal process, I think there was 18 meetings, lots of resident engagement, the voters also voted down a project that would have added 49 units. I think local objections is always going to win over statewide interests, which is why we feel really strongly that this conversation needs to be taken up for the municipalities and happening across the state level and happening at a regional level like this. Our municipalities are so small that it's really smart to think about us as a whole region as opposed to the individual municipalities. Because if you think about it, if every single municipality in our region says no to housing, I don't know where that leaves us. If nobody's willing to build any of the 24,000 units that we need, that just leaves us in a really, really critical position. And I also know that I'm probably not the most popular person in this room by saying that, knowing who the audience is, but we at the Chamber look at the region globally. We look at it as a whole and what all the different aspects are that make our region work. We need businesses to be attracted to Greater Portland. We need workers to be attracted here. I think workers are attracted here. We live in a pretty awesome place, but if they can't afford to live here, it's just a non-starter. So we are looking at this much more holistically. We are a regional chamber. We represent Portland and the 7 surrounding communities around Portland. And we also care a lot about the communities that are not in our footprint. We care a lot about Yarmouth. We care a lot about Biddeford and Saco. A lot of our members live there. So we look at us collectively as an entire region and what we as a region need to be doing together. And I think it might have been the governor who mentioned, or it might have been Jarrod who mentioned change. And I think one of the reasons why a lot of these housing developments are getting voted down by the residents is people fear change. It's a very normal human reaction. And I think people are looking at growth equals change, which is true. But I'm here to tell you, no growth also equals change. Like, we will change, change is a constant, change is inevitable. And I would think if we are going to change, don't we want to be on the side of impacting that change and actually structuring what that change looks like and making sure that that change fits within our community and that we have the resources and the support to actually lift up that change. So I want this group to just take away that we are going to change as a region, and I think we really want to make that change intentional going forward. And so I encourage everybody to look at it that way and try to take the fear factor out of growth. And I think the last thing that I'll say is just when you think of our communities, we want our communities to be able to house those who currently live there and those who want to live there, who are really going to add to the economy and add to the fabric of our communities. We want our children to be able to leave their parents' houses and live in the communities where they grew up. Maybe rent an apartment there, eventually buy a first home there, raise their family there, and then on the back end, people who are retiring, we want them to be able to leave their family home that they lived in for 30 years, buy a condo in that community. So we really need housing of all levels to support all people in all different phases of their life. So I think today is such an incredible opportunity to bring all of you together. I encourage you to take off your municipal hats and put on your regional hats and just think about this need for housing as a region and the role each municipality can play in addressing the needs around housing. So I want to thank you for having me here. Kristina, thank you for the invitation to be here, and I'm really excited to be a part of today's conversation. And just know the Portland Regional Chamber stands ready to help in housing however we can. It is our #1 issue. Thank you.
Hi everyone, Liz Cotter, Schlax, President and CEO of United Way of Southern Maine, and we do work in the housing space. And today I'm going to use my few minutes to introduce you to some data that we will not have time to deep dive into today, but that I want you to know we have, and we want to support you in your efforts to support your communities. And this data really helps to highlight the challenge that we all know intuitively is happening in our community related to housing affordability. So let's see if I can get the technology to operate. It works, I love it. Okay, so I have a couple of quick slides here where we are going to talk about this new data program that our community has entered into in the state of Maine with all the United Ways in Maine, sponsored generously by the John T. Grohman Foundation, which is a data project called United for Alice. And who is Alice that we're talking about? And that acronym is used in lots of different ways, but today we're talking about people who are asset limited, income constrained, employed. Those are the frontline workers that we were all spending lots of time talking about, thinking about, and caring about for a few key years recently. They are the people that make our economic engine grow and go in our state, and they are people who are struggling right now and have been for decades to meet a basic budget to be able to afford the basic cost of living. And as we've heard here today, what are those basics? Food, shelter, those basics. And so shelter is obviously a key element of what we're talking about here. One of the things that may surprise you, because we are used to talking about the federal poverty level, and that is a number that many of us are familiar with. A lot of our benefit programs are based on the federal poverty level. That's terminology that many of us are familiar with. And in southern Maine, you can see on the graph on the right, that 9% of people in southern Maine, of the 220,000 households, this is by households, 9% of those households would be categorized as at the federal poverty level or below. However, an additional 29% of households are what we would call in that ALICE category. These are people who are working. These are people who are struggling. And so when you combine those together, you get 38% of households in our area that struggle every month to meet a basic survivability budget. In the state of Maine, you'll see on the larger pie on the left, that's 42% in the whole state. But we're not that different here in southern Maine. And don't worry, all of this data is available online, and I want you to dig into it. So we'll get you that information. But one of the key things that we wanted to talk about today, and one of the reasons we're here, is, as you can imagine, the ALICE population, while it does encompass all ages, all genders, all ethnicities, some groups experience hardship at greater rates than others. That will not surprise you. And this is where we're talking about equity in our community as well. And so those who are under 25 and over 65 are struggling more than the rest of the population. 65% of Black households and 52% of Asian households in southern Maine are struggling at that ALICE level or below. And the staggering statistic of 68% of female-headed households in southern Maine are struggling to meet that basic survivability budget. So what is that budget that we're talking about? Well, this ridiculous, may I say, federal poverty level budget would tell you that a single adult could live on about $13,000 a year. And it would also say that a family of 4 could somehow magically live on $26,500. So we can immediately disregard that as ridiculous. But this survivability budget, which is based on real data, real costs in our real area, tells us that $35,000 is needed for a single adult, approximately, to live in our area, and $80,000 is needed for a family of 4 with 2 kids in childcare. What's included in this survivability budget? Just these basics: housing, childcare, technology, healthcare, just those basic things. You don't see birthday presents on here. You don't see saving for retirement. You don't see a family vacation. This is the basics. And here are the details related to that, but I just want to bring you to the bottom line, which is an hourly wage of $17.35 is required for a single adult here, and that 2 adults, 2 children, about $40, that household wage between those 2 adults. I also want to, and I wanted to show you, of course, as you know, the extremely high percentage of that household budget that is related to housing and the utilities that go along with it. Not a surprise to you, but that's why housing affordability is essential to the discussion of people's ability to survive on a basic budget. I think that was probably intuitive for you, but you can see the data here. And we can see that of those ALICE families, it is more than about 49% of those families are spending more than 30% of their income on housing, which we know is the threshold for affordability. Why? Because you need that other 70% of your income to pay for all the other stuff besides housing. So you're shirking or you're scrimping on all those other things if you are paying too much for your housing. So what can you do? You can become more aware of this data and information. You can use the tools at your disposal related to policy, related to advocacy, related to information to employers and others in your community around these issues. And we welcome you to be a partner with us as we work on housing affordability, as we work on the basic cost of living for the families in our community who keep our engine running. Thank you so very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Rebeccah Sanders. I'm the CEO of the Natural Resources Council of Maine. And for over 60 years, NRCM has worked to protect, conserve, and restore Maine's environment and protect the nature of Maine. And I don't think there's any day that our team doesn't wake up that we don't think about climate change. And so today I'm here to talk to you about how we're thinking about climate change in the intersection with housing and housing development. You know, over the last couple of months, I think we can't deny that we're seeing climate in our daily lives. These last couple of storms that have lashed our shores and destroyed some historic structures and damaged our homes, our businesses, and our community infrastructure really tell us that we don't have much time to waste and that we need to take action now. So how do we do this in a way that still meets growing community needs? And why am I here talking to you about this as the Natural Resources Council of Maine talking about housing? Well, housing is responsible for about 19% of our greenhouse gas emissions in the state of Maine. And so for us, housing issues are climate issues. We can't separate those two things. Tackling the climate crisis today and for tomorrow actually gives us an opportunity in the way that we like to think about it at NRCM, which is an opportunity to rethink how we live, where we build, and what we prioritize going forward. Maine has done an incredible job of continuing to adopt energy efficient strategies and drive weatherization that improves energy efficiency of our existing homes and building infrastructure. But as we look to the future, we really need to think about the incentives to do that up front. How much we love our Maine villages where people can walk downtown and see each other, go to the library. I was just talking about with my table mate over there, go to the grocery. How much of that feels like that's a central part of who we are in the state of Maine. As we think about housing development moving forward, how can we continue to do that, build more communities that embrace that also think about bikeability, walkability, and lowering our need for traveling by car, which is Maine's actual largest contributor to our carbon emissions. So smart design also increases our opportunity to embrace the benefits of natural infrastructure. The nature of Maine is one reason that so much of us love where we live and one of the drivers for people coming to Maine. And we think that denser housing actually is sort of antithetical to that you're living in a subdivision and you're not going to be able to access those forests and fields and streams and ponds that you all love. But if you design well, you can actually create clear pathways to access nature that also will build upon and embrace the ecosystem services that our fields, our wetlands, and our ponds and forests provide to us, sequestering carbon and addressing things like these increasing rain events where they'll actually be able to absorb the water that's falling without needing to build as much gray infrastructure to do that work. As we face the increasing need for housing in Maine, it's imperative that climate considerations are incorporated into our strategies and that we protect the nature of what makes Maine so special. We know that climate is going to drive more people to come to our amazing state. At the same time, that many communities around the coasts and our rivers are having to think about managed retreat from those areas. So as we think about this, we know there's a potential for inequitable results for those people, as we were just talking about, that have fewer resources. NRCM is looking forward to partnering with you in this sort of new space for us and how we think about creating new homes for the people of Maine and doing it in a way that allows us to thrive in a climate-altered future. Thank you so much.
I want to thank all of you. Thank you so much for sharing. I think you've all made the point that if you care about the economy, if you care about climate and open space, if you care about social and racial equity, then we all have a stake in our housing success together. So thank you very much. One more round of applause for our panelists. In this next section, we're welcoming questions, and you have some cards on your table where you can fill out your question, and our staff will be collecting them and trying to take as many as we possibly can in the next section. I am very pleased to announce that we have Ryan Fecto, who is going to moderate our next section, and I would love for Ryan to come to the stage. Where are you, Ryan? Oh, I see you. Making your way. Thank you. Ryan is the Senior Officer of Policy and Planning at Avesta Housing, and many of you know him also as the former Speaker of the House of the Maine House of Representatives. Ryan has been a real leader in housing at the state level, and he's also been a real leader now that he's joined Avesta Housing. Ryan, I want to thank you so much for moderating this session and for taking your time today. So thank you, Ryan, and welcome.
So today's presentation will include roughly 15 minutes slideshow presentation from Greg and from Jeff. Each will get 15 minutes, and then we'll have a 10-minute Q&A. And again, there are note cards on your table, so please feel free to write down some questions, and we'll open it up to the public. So I'm excited to first introduce Jeff Levine, who is a faculty member in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Prior to joining MIT, Jeff was the Director of Planning and Urban Development at the City of Portland from 2012 to 2019, and the Director of Planning and Community Development at the town of Brookline, Massachusetts from 2005 to 2012. Jeff has over 25 years of experience working with cities and towns. He's also the author of the book Leadership in Planning and numerous publications concerning urban planning. So without further ado, Jeff Levine.
So I've been asked to talk about U.S. housing policy, all of it, in 10 minutes, 15 minutes at most. So I was like, I can do this. And I did what most normal people do, particularly the students I work with at MIT. I went to ChatGPT and I said, tell me about U.S. housing policy. It's really fun to play around with it, actually. Just quickly what ChatGPT came up with, the creation of the Federal Housing Administration in 1934, that created the idea of mortgage insurance, pretty important idea. The passage of the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, which we all know as the GI Bill in 1944, provided low-cost mortgages, job training programs, as we all know, increased home ownership, but it also created a lot of suburban development. That was kind of what it was designed to subsidize. There's also a lot of questions about how equitable it was in terms of race, but it certainly was a pivotal moment in U.S. housing policy. 1968, the passage of the Fair Housing Act that prohibited discriminatory practices in housing for the first time, really explicitly. Big deal. 1965, the creation of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and this is where I don't know why they flipped those two dates, but anyway, another big deal, the U.S. federal government says we're going to be involved in the housing market and not just in the mortgage market. In 2008, the Recovery Act, after what Governor Mills referred to as the Great Recession, which for some reason we call the Great Recession, really aimed to stabilize the housing market, and then finally Dodd-Frank in 2010. I was marginally impressed with this list. I thought it was a good start, but ChatGPT isn't quite there yet, so I wanted to add to that list a little bit, and that's what I'm going to do now. First off, it didn't talk about zoning at all. And I think I have some theories about why. That's a much longer conversation, but so I'm here to at least, part of what I want to talk about is zoning, not surprisingly, given the event. And I think what I like to say about zoning is we're all worried about how to pay for housing. By fixing your zoning, you can actually help subsidize housing without actually costing you any money. because we are artificially constraining the market with zoning. And we're doing that for various reasons, some of which are good and some of which are fear and some of which maybe aren't so good. But by writing your zoning and making it to allow more housing, you're basically subsidizing the housing market for free. And I think that's lost a lot of the time in terms of sort of the market. It's not going to create the housing, but at least creates the platform for it. One of the reasons I like to start with one of these mortgage risk maps, we all have heard a lot about redlining and how certainly initially banks, when they started doing things like the GI Bill, said it's not good to to subsidize and to pay for mortgages in certain areas. And they picked areas of cities and towns, including ones in Maine, that they said, we don't want to give mortgages in these areas. These are high-risk areas, and they tended to color them in red, and that's where the term redlining came from. Those areas were often low income, they were often minority-owned areas. They were also often the areas that needed the investment the most in the first place. They had the worst housing stock, they had potential for more housing development, and the pattern was to say that you can't do this. You can't get mortgages in these areas. So there was definitely some efforts to fix that, certainly the bills that I mentioned. But at the same time as banks and the financial markets were worried about this, communities were also worried about this. And this is where I don't always think it was for the right reason. This is just an example of something you can find a lot of these slides online. They're pretty disturbing. And the idea that zoning will save us from the other. So you look at this diagram and it shows X's next to the quote unquote bad houses that have people we don't want to live near. And this is, at first I thought this was about something else. This is about a zoning plan for St. Louis. So actually, 100 years ago when zoning first came out, there were explicitly zones for different races. That was something that was part of the original zoning pattern. Even before they thought of sort of single family zoning, they thought about segregating by race. Fortunately, and in a rare moment of sort of clarity, the Supreme Court in 1916 basically said you can't do that. Explicitly, at least, you can't do that. And so a lot of the patterns changed then to looking at other ways of separating by race and income. And then, in the 1970s, I think a lot of the activism that was generally looking to change the world, and often in good ways, really glommed onto the idea of the environment. And downzoning areas became a way to be virtuous and to save the environment. And I think there is a nexus there. Zoning at its best can help protect the environment, but oftentimes the idea was the more you downzone, the more you've done a favor to the environment. And this really caught on for a long time, all the way through the 1990s. This is why we often refer to zoning as regulatory redlining. It's a way of basically creating segregation by actual government rules, and not explicit ones because, the Supreme Court said you couldn't do that, but to really sort of, to do it by other ways. So zoning went from the original idea, which is let's keep the slaughterhouses and the places where people live away from each other, because the slaughterhouses are bad places to live near, and really started separating us as people, and I think that's really unfortunate. There's definitely been some state responses to that in Maine and in other states. We're at a moment now where states are looking at how zoning can fit in with local plans, but also fit in with statewide needs. And it's sort of an exciting time in some ways. You look, for example, and it's not just in Maine, this is in Louisville, Kentucky, which is one of the places that was notorious for segregating both de facto and under zoning. And they've been looking very closely at their zoning and trying to figure out how it fits in with some of their policy goals. So they're looking at the single family zoning in Louisville, which is a pretty major city, and 75% of the county which surrounds it is zoned for single family residential, and they're trying to figure out what to do about that. We've also thought of that. GPCOG, I was able to work with GPCOG on a similar study of 13 communities in the greater Portland region, and it came out in 2 parts a couple of years ago. It's on their website. And it looked at what Louisville is doing, and it looked very specifically at what's going on in these 13 communities in the greater Portland region. And we started off with the idea of let's look at where multifamily housing is allowed, and isn't just to get some data on that. But as I read the zoning codes, and unfortunately for me, I think I really like reading zoning codes, I sort of quickly realized it's a lot more complicated than that. It may say it allows multifamily housing, but when you look at other things, it's sort of like a death by a thousand cuts. You can see all these ways in which, although you may be able to put a two-family home on a lot in theory in a community, it's not really practically possible. They've put other barriers in the way of doing so. These can include relatively straightforward things such as parking requirements. It can be very large lot sizes and requiring a much larger lot for a duplex than for a single family home. It can be something sort of that seems pretty benign at first, which is requiring discretionary review, having to get approval to do it, which sounds relatively straightforward, but time and time again we hear that people who are thinking of adding another unit on their building don't want to take the risk of drawing up a lot of plans and spending a lot of money only to go to the city or town planning board and be told you can't do that. So even that risk keeps it from happening. There were others, but those are the types of things we looked at. And GPCOG's able mapping staff was able to map a lot of the data that we came up with. And this is sort of the overall regional map of where multifamily housing is allowed, isn't allowed, and then more often has different levels of limits. So you'll see as you shade from the darker colors to the lighter colors, you go from places where there are very few limits on doing multifamily housing to where there are some limits, one or two of these sort of limiting factors, to where there's many limits, which is a majority of the region, and then places where it's simply not allowed, where I think at least I give those places credit for saying what they mean and meaning what they say. We only want single family homes here. So just to summarize for this region, these 13 communities, you have about 5% of the land that's zoned, in my opinion, truly for multifamily housing, where you really can look to put a duplex or a triplex or an apartment building, any of those. You then look at, 65% of the region that has what I would term many limits. I think it was 4 or more of these factors. So 65% of the land says it allows multifamily housing, but in my opinion, really basically doesn't, unless you really are willing to jump through a lot of hoops and have a lot of extra land and can meet a very specific subset of criteria. It's important to note this work was done before a lot of the zoning changes from LD 2003. I think that a lot of the conversation during the commission for LD 2003 was about some of these limits and what can we do about them. But nonetheless, it does show how much land we have where we're basically artificially tamping down the market and then saying housing is too expensive. And I think this is it's a pretty simple solution. Why do we care about multifamily housing? We're talking about housing, and I actually think single family homes are fine. Single family homes on large lots are okay. Single family homes on small lots are okay. I think there's nothing wrong with single family housing, and no one suggests that people shouldn't have the ability to buy a single family home in this region. But multifamily housing provides a lot of opportunities that aren't provided by single family homes. It allows people to remain in their community if they need a single level living, say they're elderly or in a wheelchair. It allows people's children who maybe aren't making as much as them to remain in the community they grew up in. So often they have to leave their community, and then if they get lucky, they can afford a home back in the city or town they grew up in. Also, people who are experiencing financial challenges who are already in the community that nowadays may have to leave because they can't make their mortgage payments anymore, they can't pay their tax bills anymore. If they have the flexibility to put a second unit on their building, they may be able to remain in their community. And I think that's a great solution to that kind of situation. So I think there's a lot of reasons to care about these things, and I don't need to repeat other ones to you, and other people have talked about those. But it's important to realize this isn't either or. This isn't single family versus multifamily. No one is saying you should have to build multifamily on your property, but there is something about choice that I think is important, and it's kind of, built into the American character. If it seems like a problem to someone else, it's a problem to a lot of people in Maine. This is some housing data on the greater Portland region from Maine Housing. And at the bottom, you see the sort of relatively flat line, which is what's happened to incomes. They've gone up about 50% since 2001. That sounds great until you look at the blue line, which is what's happened to the housing costs and housing prices, which have gone up 300% in that time. So that gap has gotten wider and wider, and that is a problem for the region. That means fewer and fewer people can afford housing here based on the incomes you're getting here. It's no surprise that telecommuters, people who have assets and are wealthy, or people who earned a lot of money earlier in their life and now come here and maybe are willing to earn a little less money for part of their career, are the ones who are most likely to be able to afford this housing. People who are in this region, have been in this region for a long time, often struggle to stay here. There's nothing really healthy about that gap. I guess I already said that. So in conclusion, I know I've touched on zoning a lot. I do want to touch on a couple other things that I think ChatGPT missed. I think there's a lot of potential for communities to develop affordable housing trusts to help pay for the type of housing they want to see in their community. This is like a piggy bank for housing development. You're not sure what money you're going to put into it, but maybe you have a little bit of unencumbered fund balance at the end of your fiscal year. Maybe you sell a property and you have some extra proceeds. Maybe you have some zoning rules that require some fees in lieu of other things and can be put into this sort of piggy bank to help pay for affordable or market rate housing in your community. Looking at land banks and land trusts, ways of turning around existing underutilized land that's just sort of sitting there neglected for various reasons, and there's been some recent movement at the state level on land banks that I think is really, really exciting. Looking at things like providing loan products, soft second mortgages, subsidized mortgages, loan guarantees, ways that maybe you can help push the market to provide the type of housing you want to see. Looking at rent stabilization, and I think when you hear rent stabilization, you immediately think rent control. And we can have a long debate about that, but there's a huge range of rent stabilization, from sort of the strictest rent control you see in places like New York City and in Portland, to some simple stabilization saying people can't have their rent raised by more than a certain amount every year, and that's pretty basic. These are things that I think are worth exploring. Looking at community-based lending, looking at ways to help the mortgage market, help people get access to the loan products they need. And then finally, looking at federal grant and loan programs, using the HOME program, using the low-income housing tax credit program, a number of other federal programs that exist both in urban and rural areas. There's a lot of alphabet soup at the federal level, and seeing as much of that money, which is our taxpayer money, coming back to the region is something I'd love to see communities work on. I see I have 45 seconds left, so I'm right on time. Thank you very much.
Lots of places in America are struggling with, the dark spots there with with housing affordability. We are here too in Maine. One of the things I want to just mention about this study is that it's a little different from any other housing study I've ever seen. And that is because it is both a housing study and an economic study. It really, as you can see in number 1 there, the idea is just as we would think about it. We have X number of households, Y number of units. What's the difference between those two things? The second part of it, though, what they were looking at is if we filled all the jobs that we have available right now, if our economy was actually functioning at full throttle, those are the units that we would need. It's a combination of those two things. So as we keep going through this, and as you read this kind of on your own, what you'll see is that HRNA just sort of walked through these various drivers of trends that have made things more difficult, including in migration. This is one of the more interesting pieces, that over the 5 years in this study here, we saw a net decline in rental units. That's not because we aren't trying on the rent restricted side. That part has been gaining traction, but the other housing, rental housing, has not. There's a lot in here around vacant homes that is interesting to look at, and purchasing capacity on the home ownership and rental side. But kind of getting to the punchline of this study is that Maine needs another 38,500 additional homes to create housing availability for all Mainers, and again, and to attract and retain workers to support the existing economy. I think if you're looking just at the kind of unit deficit, it's something like 12 or 13,000 out of that 38,500. The other kind of punchline from this study is, as we look out to 2030 and our demographic change and population growth estimates, we'll need beyond that 38,500 another 40-something thousand additional units here in Maine. And so we have a lot of work to do. There's some other things attached to my slides here that I just included for folks to go through separately, just as I thought it would be a good resource. I want to kind of just talk through some of the approaches that we've been using within the administration. And I will say the single highest priority for the Mills administration in dealing with this crisis is adding supply. That is the thing we are most focused on. We want to better meet demand and improve affordability. We have focused on increasing supply in two specific ways. One is unprecedented investments in programs that work, housing development programs that work. I'm not sure if the governor said this, but from 2000 to 2018, Maine invested a total of $65 million in affordable housing production. Since she took office, that number is about $285 million. There's been investments through general obligation bonds, refinancing revenue bonds, the creation of a new state housing tax credit that the governor mentioned, the allocation of tens of millions of ARPA funds, allocation of general fund dollars. Various approaches have been used to try to add as many units as we can. And those investments have led to, as the governor mentioned, the largest pipeline of housing in Maine housing's history. Those units are providing new affordable options for people across the state to rent and own. And in a little over a year, it will include the new Housing First initiative that can help make Maine the first state in the country to end chronic homelessness. And I will just call out for municipalities interested in this, who are struggling with homelessness in your municipality, I encourage you to talk with us and with Maine Housing about Housing First. It is a solution. I know shelters are hard. This is a solution, and it works well, and I want to give a shout out to Avesta and Preble Street for the success that Housing First. So besides these investments in production programs that work, the other way that we're trying to increase housing supply is through zoning and land use. And I think our understanding here is that we know that the shortfall we're dealing with now is too big for us to handle solely with affordable housing development programs. The per unit cost of those programs is simply too high. Maine does not have the money to do that as its only approach. And so the idea with zoning and land use in the big picture really is just about helping the private market have a bigger role in addressing this problem. That's what it's all about. We know folks here are very familiar with LD 2003, LD 1706 from this legislature too. Beyond passing that law, though, and beyond passing any law, it becomes really important to implement it well, to operationalize it. Without that piece, what's the point? And I guess I just want to call out, because they're here right now, both those elements, passing a bill like this. Ryan, obviously when he was speaker, he was the quarterback of that effort. He made that happen at the legislature, and we're so grateful to him for that. In addition to that, when we're talking about implementation through the Housing Opportunity Program, that is, at DECD, that is the work of technical assistance, grants every year, $2.5 million in grants every year to municipalities and regional organizations. That work is being done by Hillary Gove and Ben Averill, who I hope will stand up here, and I know you're mad at me right now, but if you wouldn't mind standing up. If folks here in the room don't know Hillary and Ben, I encourage you to get to know them. They are really good at what they do, and landing the plane of LD 2003 is not easy. There's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of working with municipalities. It seems to be going pretty well in the end here, but Hillary and Ben are a huge part of that, and I want to say thank you to both of you for the great work you've done. I want to just end here with a few things that are happening right now that folks might be interested in. The supplemental budget is obviously being deliberated upon right now by the legislature. The governor does have in that supplemental budget request another $10 million for the Affordable Homeownership Program that's at Maine Housing, along with $16 million in emergency housing relief funds, because we know that the most painful consequence of an undersupply of housing is homelessness. And the administration is not going to leave anyone behind. Also in the supplemental budget, there is a reorganization of existing state programs into a standalone office that would provide more robust and coordinated planning support, technical assistance, and funding opportunities that local communities need. This new office, known as the Office of Community Affairs, if approved by the legislature, would be something of a one-stop shop for municipalities that right now maybe have to work with multiple departments, and trying to get information out of the state maybe is more painful than it needs to be. The whole point of the Office of Community Affairs is to bring a lot of that work into one place. The last thing I want to mention is that HRNA that helped us with this housing needs study is working with us on the launch of a new dashboard that's going to have a broad array of housing and economic and demographic data that's going to be just updated over time as that data itself is updated for the whole state. The purpose of it is to help communities, housing organizations, and the public assess trends, compare geographies, and inform housing goals. That will go live next month. I am going to stop there. And I think turn it back to Jeff for a little bit. But thank you all very much, and thank you for the invitation.
Well, thanks, Greg, and thanks, Jeff. I think that was a very good setup for the conversation we're going to have very briefly, and then open it up for comments and questions from the audience. Jeff, you spoke obviously about some of the history that's fueled the housing shortage today. And while the history of housing might include roads paved with ill intentions, as you alluded to in your presentation, how do we overcome the reality that people have a fondness for the way their neighborhoods are right now, and the current conditions are how they derive their sense of place?
Sure, that's a great question. It's really important to reckon with. I think that most communities, when they look at their current zoning and land use regulations and compare it to what people say they like about their community, find a big disconnect. That what the things they usually love most about their community are not necessarily allowed under their current zoning regulations. So I would encourage communities to look closely at what they love about their communities and try to make their land use codes allow more of it. More of the village centers people like, more of those great little walkable neighborhoods with sidewalks and small lot single family homes with maybe some duplexes mixed in. That's often what people like about New England villages. And the other thing they like is preserving open space and preserving farmland and forest land. And I think most communities' current zoning doesn't really do a great job at either of those.
It's interesting because Ben and Hillary were participated in this, but we had a accessory dwelling unit stakeholder group that I led when I was still in the governor's office, and we had a presentation from someone who had worked with municipalities across the country. And one story he shared was a community where the town was a little bit apprehensive about allowing for certain types of housing types on parcels throughout the community. And what they did was they took the best elements of this house in town that everyone loved. Like, it was the house you thought of when you thought of this community, and they pre-approved a building design that was a duplex, a triplex, a quadplex, a courtyard model of housing, all based on the design of that one house. So it allowed the community to take that step into waters of allowing housing types that they didn't previously allow on these lots, but without the scary thing of like, what will the developer propose? What kind of ugly building will the developer put on this lot? They had control over what that design would look like. So it was a way for them to take that dive into waters that they had not previously gone into before. So cool idea from a community in Texas. Greg, your presentation provides us with a lot of data, which you didn't get to really dive into. given the time constraints, but certainly folks will be able to look at that later on if they haven't already dived into that. I don't know how many pages are in that report, hundreds?
Yeah.
But even still, with where we are today, we find ourselves short of the healthy 5% vacancy rate that we need to have a healthy housing stock. And current residents and prospective residents are competing, obviously, for limited supply. So you mentioned a few, but what are some of the actions that either the state or local communities could take to get the ship turned around and moving us back in the right direction on housing?
I mean, you know, the reality is, I think in terms of making a dynamic change to the current scenario, there's nothing short of a coordinated federal investment in the housing undersupply that exists nationwide. That's the only way we are going to see significant, massive change in our housing struggle. And I think what we're left with in the meantime is understanding that as a state, because the issues causing our housing crisis are beyond our state. It's sort of like trying to solve climate change from within the state of Maine. The dynamics are beyond our control. What we can do is focus on the resources we have and be as efficient as we possibly can with them. And so, you know, I think that obviously, one of the things we'd love to figure out is a dedicated source of revenue for housing development. That would be fantastic. It's something that the Joint Select Committee on Housing has talked about. You know, there is a good amount of federal energy efficiency money that's about to come down the pike, and I think it's going to be incumbent on us to make sure that we make the most of that opportunity. And that'll come in the next few months. I will just, kind of one other thing I wanted to mention, because the governor mentioned it in her remarks, is that one of the problems that was called out in the study is that, you know, they have this really big numbers for the progress we need to make. And then you break it down into region, and it's not, you know, it begins to become maybe a little more manageable. But as the report pointed out, we have no means right now to track progress because, like building permits, for example, the only way you can get information about that is an incredibly unreliable database at HUD. That it is not good data. It doesn't show us what's happening. And so she mentioned it because I think the administration would love to work with the municipalities to deal with that. Like, it can't be that hard in the end. You know, like, it's all information the municipalities have. Maybe there's some funding that needs to be provided to municipalities to help upload that data. But right now we have no way of tracking. Are we making progress? And if so, how much? And so that is one other thing that I think we would like to try to work on in the coming years.
Great. Good. We'll now open it up to the audience questions. I'm not sure who's collecting. Oh, perfect.
Right over here. I think my microphone's on. Yes, we have been collecting these. We have a lot. We'll get through as many as we possibly can. And Ryan, I'm glad you're up there because I think you're going to be answering a few. Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. So the first one is, has a Massachusetts type 40B statute been contemplated for Maine? And that statute, I Googled it. I did not know this. That statute, what it allows is for zoning boards of appeal to approve affordable housing developments with more flexible rules, provided that there is a percentage of them that have long-term affordability restrictions. So has something like that been contemplated, a state statute?
The answer is, I think that yes, it's been contemplated. I don't think it got very far. I don't think, honestly, the politics are kind of aligned for something like that. I do think New Hampshire also has another way of doing it that seems to kind of carry a lot less anxiety around it. It seems to work pretty successfully. But I think that the administration, at least, has been really focused, again, on landing the plane on LD 2003, making sure municipalities have what they need to implement that, and getting funding to the municipalities to do more. I'm not aware of any conversations about a 40B-ish kind of thing in Maine coming up again. I mean, it may, but It's not something the administration's talking about right now.
All right, well, following hot on the heels of that question, lawsuits and the current process for litigating these lawsuits are a big impediment to development. Any project can be delayed by 2.5 to 5 years. Again, is there an effort at the state level to address this level of the ability of communities to challenge something that's been passed and make it wait for many, many years?
Probably the same answer as before. I don't think there's anything pending on that issue.
Okay. These two are related. As we continue to see new housing rejected by referenda, what policies do you recommend to manage this and local folks' general unwillingness to grow on change? And then I just want to put this one on the same page. On the same day that the affordable project failed in Cumberland, Avesta's project for older adults passed in Kennebunk. Is there anything Avesta did during their planning process that accounts for this success that others can learn from?
Well, I mean, I don't think you can really compare and contrast necessarily between communities, but I can say one thing that was unique about the project in Kennebunk for Avesta, and it still has to go through the local approvals project as well, but Kennebunk Savings Bank donated the land for that project. They also are making a financial contribution to the construction of that project in Kennebunk, and they were heavily involved in making sure that community members were informed about the project. They were amazing at going to community meetings and meeting with neighbors and providing information to the public through mailers and advertising. And I think that having a community partner step up to the plate and not just a passive manner, like here's some land you can build a house on, build some apartments on, but we're going to donate land, we're going to make a financial contribution, and we're going to be actively involved in making sure that this project gets approved, I think made a world of difference in that community. And that's really, I think, to Quincy's point earlier, this is really what we need to move the ball forward for housing, is to make sure that it's not just those of us in the room who care about the issue, but those of us who aren't in the room currently who care about the issue or haven't really thought about why they care about the issue, particularly employers who have a huge need for workforce, but maybe haven't been at the plate in the batting box as they should be on this issue. And we need them to start taking some swings and making contact with the ball. For some reason, I'm using a baseball reference, but spring training or something. But I think that's really important. That was important in Kennebunk.
Yeah, I mean, election night, that was a hard night. And I do congratulate Avesta and Kennebunk Savings for their work on that one. That was, it was also a project for older Mainers as opposed to families. There was a very hard vote in Kingfield that went in directions that are painful. And I don't know. I suspect that so long as we continue to operate in a system where the comfortably housed get to decide where and when others are comfortably housed, we can't be surprised by results like we saw on election night.
Okay, a couple of policy questions. Jeff, this is directed to you. Are you familiar with the Community Preservation Act in Massachusetts?
Yep.
Okay, and what do you think about Maine passing something like that? Do you think that would be helpful? What do you think?
So a nutshell of what the CPA is without taking up too much time, it allows communities to voluntarily vote to increase the property taxes in that community by between 1% and 3%. And the carrot for that is that the state will match some portion of that. So let's say a community votes to adopt the Community Preservation Act and increase their taxes 2%. In theory, the state matches that 2%. Now, in reality, the matching funds have struggled, so it's gotten as low as a 15% match, but there's always been a match. And the restriction is you have to use that money on one of three things: affordable housing, open space, or historic preservation. It was really slow out the gate the first few years because a lot of communities were worried about the loss of local control. I think it's fair to say many, if not most, communities have now adopted it in Massachusetts. I think it's a good model. I think the challenge with the way it's structured is a stable funding source, which in their case is a tax at the Registry of Deeds. You pay an extra like $20 when you record something at the registry. And then I found through looking at different communities, the communities that tend to need more housing tend to put more of that money into open space. Communities that need open space tend to put more of that money into housing. So there is this question of like, you can put most of that money into any one of those three pots. What about the actual needs in your community? But I think it's a great way to leverage local willingness to increase their taxes with the state match in theory.
Okay, another policy, vacancy fees. Could we use vacancy fees in communities to help mitigate our housing crisis? So charging people who have a home that they're not living in, it's a second home that's frequently vacant. Do you think it's an effective tool?
I think there are a lot of potential financial levers that could be pulled. A lot of it depends on what politically is palatable, but certainly looking at fiscal policy and seeing how we could incentivize the right types of uses, including workforce housing and year-round housing, is worth looking at.
So today I am joined by a panel of municipal leaders from Westbrook, Portland, Biddeford, Bridgeton, and Yarmouth to talk about municipal housing-focused initiatives and successes, and to hear their insights on strategies to expand housing. And usually I'm the one sitting in the hot seat being asked questions by municipal leaders, so you don't know how excited I am to be asking the questions today. So I'm gonna jump right over here and we're gonna jump in with introductions. So if I can, is this on? Can you hear me okay? Okay. Yep. If I can ask all of you, Erin, let's start with you. If you would just introduce yourself, name, position, municipality, and then if you could list your top 2 impacts or challenges that you're observing in your community.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Erin Zwirko. I'm the Director of Planning and Development for the Town of Yarmouth. And I think the top 2 challenges that we're facing is community support and consensus around new housing, and then also figuring out where it should be. So I would say that's my 2.
Thank you.
Thank you. I am Tori Hill. I'm the Community Development Director for the Town of Bridgeton. And I would say that our top 2 challenges right now are finding folks who can live and work in our community. We have a big discrepancy between the cost of living and the average income in Bridgeton. We're also struggling with our housing stock and vacancy rate, so I'd say that's our second challenge.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Marty Grohman. I have the honor and pleasure of serving as mayor of Biddeford. I am also employed at Eden Peabody, right around the corner, where I do startup advising and counseling, helping startups grow. Always been a passion of mine. And all my career, I've wanted to have a job with an office in Portland. Now I finally have one, and I'm never there because I'm really busy as mayor, but it's a great honor of a job to do. I know Councilor Schlaver is here from the city of Biddeford, lots of people from our sister city, Saco. You know, a couple of challenges. I would say for me, a big frustration has been the time between permitting and groundbreaking. We got a lot of good stuff going on in Biddeford. I get to go to a lot of ribbon cuttings, which is amazing. I haven't gotten to go to a groundbreaking yet, and there have been projects, you know, since 2019 in the queue, so that's definitely one of the things I want to dig into.
Good afternoon, Mark Dion. I'm currently serving as mayor of Portland. I hate answering questions that require a listing of things, but I'll say this. Myself and my colleagues on the council work to see what we can do to make Portland more affordable in terms of housing and other economic issues. The second thing that I'm pretty passionate about is creating a work culture in inspections and permitting that get us to yes faster than we have historically, because permitting is where things slow down and billing hours go up, and it has a real impact on the capacity of something to maintain the ability to pencil out in terms of budgets regarding construction. So it's a little bit arcane, but key decisions by the city often occur in that particular arena and have a consequence on a decision by a developer to initiate a project in our city or not.
Thank you. My name is Jerre Bryant. I am the city administrator for the city of Westbrook, have been for over 21 years. The issues that I've identified are very simple and basic. The affordability of housing in Westbrook and the availability of housing in Westbrook, and that applies to both ownership availability and rental availability.
Great, thank you. So I want to jump into to talk a little bit about housing initiatives and successes. And Jerre, we'll start with you. As was mentioned earlier, Westbrook last year issued the most building permits to support housing, which is quite impressive. Westbrook has also had notable success in supporting and promoting development for different housing options, as well as mixed-use development, which is not only making the community more vibrant, but is also contributing to economic growth. So I want to ask you, how did you make that happen, and how did you solicit community support for such impressive initiatives?
Well, first of all, the basic environment in Westbrook relative to growth and development has been quite positive and very supportive. However, that enthusiasm doesn't always transfer to housing development. Our approach was to deal with basically the attitudes that exist in some residences. We've seen examples of that in a couple of communities, unfortunately. But basically, the fact that residential development costs the municipality money as opposed to bringing in additional revenue. I think the unintentional but very direct identification that if you have new families coming into your community, your schools are growing, and school construction and operating costs are increasing as a result of that. And very unfortunately, we're all seeing examples of bias towards new Americans. And when you're building new housing and it's being occupied by people who have recently come to this country, it's unfortunately an obstacle that we have to overcome. We have to overcome the perceptions and labels. I think historically, subsidized housing or any type of housing that wasn't market rate housing was generally classified as low-income housing, had a very negative connotation, I think as the result of some perhaps poor social experiments back in the 60s and 70s, where a lot of such complexes were clustered together. That's a perception that some people continue to have and that we have to overcome. The way we approached it in Westbrook is basically a packaging of the issue. We weren't talking about just affordable housing. We weren't talking just about senior housing. We were talking about all levels of housing. The housing crisis affected everybody: senior housing, workforce housing, affordable housing, and market rate housing. So by putting it in a broader perspective, we encountered less resistance to individual projects and have been very successful in bringing forward a significant number of not just single-family housing starts, not just multi-unit, but the whole array of housing opportunities in the city of Westbrook. The tools to support this housing growth are numerous, and what we have in place in Westbrook, speaking specifically to the zoning and building regulation component, which the previous panel spoke to quite unflatteringly. Basically, we've used zoning to enable all types of housing, all categories of housing to move forward. Contract zoning, addressing density and the ability to cluster, basically it gives zoning regulations, which in themselves are quite draconian, the flexibility, the adaptability to change and to accommodate specific needs for new construction. In our downtown, We wanted to, from an economic growth and development standpoint, we wanted to bring people back into the downtown. We created an overlay zone that basically provided for higher density allowances to encourage and make more affordable the construction of residential housing, as long as the first floor was reserved for commercial use. So we weren't displacing commercial activity in the downtown, but we were supporting the growth and development of housing, and at the same time, strengthening the economy of many of those businesses that exist or would move to the downtown. We've had numerous successful projects completed at this point. We've also utilized overlay districts, which specifically encourage more dense residential development in areas that are appropriate and can have the capacity to handle that. The infrastructure capacity, basic services, conveniences like grocery stores and pharmacies, public transportation, pedestrian amenities. By making all of these appropriate and targeted areas more able to handle the construction of housing and higher density housing has also resulted in the growth that we have seen in the housing sector. A couple minor but important items that have been on the books in Westbrook for well over a decade. Number one, that accessory dwelling units are permitted uses in all residential zones. The second problem we had encountered was older subdivisions that had very small lots because at the time they were adopted, you know, a 50 by 100 foot lot was a standard size. Right now are below what the general dimensions requirements are. Essentially, we adopted an ordinance and a process whereby these smaller lots could be accessed, and by lowering the cost of land associated with constructing new housing, we were able to lower the total cost of the housing to the consumer. The other critical factor is partnerships. In Westbrook, at least, the city does not build housing or anything else for that matter. And you need to work with the entities, whether they're the public entities like your local housing authority, your nonprofits like Avesta and other housing organizations, or private developers. Basically, we've tried to work with all of those groups and partner with some of them on projects. We regularly use tax increment financing. Certainly the affordable housing TIF, I think we've used 5 or 6 times with Westbrook Housing, once with Avesta, to enable them to bring forward affordable housing projects for the community. The other way you can partner, at least in some communities, quite often the sale or even donation of public lands with specific development agreements, which obligate the entity or the business that is going to be doing the development to meet certain standards and certain goals as far as affordability, accessibility, those types of things. So what we have utilized are existing tools that we already have in the toolbox at the local level, and fortunately, we've had a good response, and we've been able to bring on a significant increase in the available new housing units in the city of Westbrook.
Thank you. I think it's really important. I mean, you touched on many things that are important to helping to promote housing, just the broad perspective, the partnership, the incentives, the zoning, all of these things have to come together to make it happen. So I want to hone in on that and ask a question of Mayor Grohman and Mayor Dion. Biddeford and Portland are 2 of very few towns in the state of Maine that have a housing trust fund. And they also have other local resources that have proven to be powerful tools in supporting housing initiatives. How has this resource, the Housing Trust Fund, or other local funding resources like TIFs, helped to address the housing challenges in your municipalities? And what do you hope to accomplish with these local resources? And I would follow on, this was not planned, but follow on to that question because you both mentioned actually building the housing, the permitting, and the approval process. Once you put the local resources out there to incentivize it, what do you need to change to make it happen faster?
Go.
Yeah. I'll let you guys battle it out.
I'm sitting here and everybody's got notes, I should have brought a brief with me so I could read from it. It'd be easier. I just want to make a quick point. In the last 3 years, Portland has approved 3,000 units of new housing. 1,600 have been completed. 600 are in the pipeline. So when I bemoan the get to yes strategy for inspections, what I'm really saying is despite our success, I want it to be faster. Before I answer the question on the Housing Trust Fund, I think I've learned as an attorney, you don't have to answer the question they ask, just answer something. I just want you to deal with the bias that goes on in this psychological market. I grew up in a tenant family. All our extended relatives were tenants. We lived in apartment neighborhoods where commercial enterprises occurred on the first floor. Now, we call that village centers today. We've buffed it up a little bit. And I bring this up because I had a conversation with some 30-somethings recently talking about housing, and one of them said, we may be the first generation where this idea of success being affiliated with owning a single detached home has evaded us. We will not realize that. And my response was, that's okay, all right? The world doesn't end if you don't have a single detached home. And then I said, but what does your ideal neighborhood look like? And many of them described our densest neighborhoods in Portland. All the amenities of living in multi-units is what they wanted, but they've been told that we need to have a single detached family home to be successful. Now, if we don't deal with that psychology, if we don't have a conversation in our communities about how we define success for this next generation, then they will valiantly try to achieve something that may or may not be in their reach. Somebody said the interest rates are low. Yeah, they were low when your house was being marketed at $60,000, but if it's $825,000 and you need a 20% down payment, I don't know a lot of 40-somethings that can come up with that liquidity. All right, so I think it's to our advantage in many, many ways to increase density in Portland downtown. The challenge, and I see 3 of my colleagues from the council sitting here, is how do we translate that density into historical suburban neighborhoods off the peninsula? And the council has come to a conclusion as a team that we may have to approach that by increasing density in what we call traffic nodal regions. I like to call it Morrill's Corner or Allen's Corner. See those words? I hate experts. They say some phrase, I go, I like that. I don't know when I'm going to use it, but I like it. All right? So these traffic nodal areas will work for housing because we on this council are marrying housing to public transportation. Not only we're going to try to convince people that dense environments are to their benefit, their children's benefit, and their extended family's benefit, it calls for economic investment in those corners, and we might have the first generation actually will take the bus. I took the bus for a couple of weeks because I had private circumstances forbidding my use of an automobile, and people would drive up in my neighborhood and roll the window and say, are you okay? I go, what's the problem? You know, I was standing at the bus stop and they thought that was kind of weird. So I think what the council as a whole, we're struggling to see how do we deliver density more efficiently and effectively and still respect the ethic that exists in many of our neighborhoods about what a single detached home neighborhood should look like. You can't just reject the past. You have to negotiate with the past to create a new future. So I want to get that out there. So it's like the old slogan, let's taste it again for the first time. Some of us grew up in those dense neighborhoods, for better or for worse. They worked for all the reasons we've talked about today. We need to find a way for their resurgence and still maintain a respect of other types of neighborhoods that do exist. Now, our housing trust fund, I'll get to the question now. Do I still have time? Maybe I've been successful in evading it altogether. The Housing Trust Fund, since 2020, we've pushed through almost $13 million into the economy of developers to bring us the housing that we need. That's really significant. Right now, the council approved a $4 million outlay to build the first limited co-op equity housing neighborhood off Douglas Street, which will be for the working person. And I hate that term too. What is a working person? I don't know. I will make one last footnote. There seems to be this idea that we can just seduce municipalities into adopting regulations. I raise my hand in caution to that. We fell victim to a similar virus on the Portland City Council, and our voters did, and passed regulations that they thought were well-intentioned, right? We call it the inclusionary zone. We'll kind of compel you to build affordable housing. And now my market, if I was to graph it, looks like a barbell. Lots of low income, economies of scale bring us high income, more expensive housing. And the middle has vanished, all right? And sometimes the middle vantage point is described in terms of single detached, but it also has an impact on the availability of affordable rental units. So we have to, and all this on the heels of a piece of referendum that thought it was doing a good thing. So I can't speak for my council, so you'll afford me the latitude to speak for myself for a moment. Be cautious with imposing regulations. Have a light touch. Understand that one ally that's often demonized are landlords, property owners. They need to be brought into the equation. They have to be brought into the equation. Their voice is as important as those who call themselves tenants. So that's what we need to do in Portland. And our housing trust fund came from monies that were paid to avoid the responsibility to create affordable housing. So think about that as a paradox, right? And what's occurred is the cost of lower income housing continues to climb. They need our investment. And those who can purchase at the other end of the barbell, they're fine. But we haven't met the challenge of that narrow tube in the middle. And I'd like to see this council finally address that. And I don't know, I think some of what I said might not make friends here today, but it's the truth as I see it, and I think as my colleagues on the council see it. And before I end my answer, I'd like Councilor Ali to stand for a moment. I know he's real thrilled with this. Come on, Pius. I bring attention to Pius because he's the OG on the council, so we do take his advice. But more importantly, he's been a long-term chair of housing and economic development, so he's somebody that you should be reaching out to. And not to be remiss, Councilors Fournier and Bullitt here as well from other committees. So thank the three of you for being here, and I hope I've answered the question.
Mayor Grohman, you can answer the question now.
Thank you. Thanks, Rebeccah. Yeah, I think Mark is right. You know, it's interesting. We have a specific example relating to what you said. So we've got a density bonus program, and I will get to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. And it has a 70% AMI requirement. And we have heard recently from developers that that's just too low. It's not getting projects built that meets that income requirement. Instead, it's getting no projects built. So I think we can get to this place where we push deals off the edge of the table. Because I think in speaking to our housing, the head of our housing authority, Guy Gagnon, we were brainstorming about this on Friday, and he said something that I think really makes sense is to get these projects built, you almost need to make them too good to be true, right? I mean, everything that goes with developing an affordable housing project is hard, and the land is expensive, and everything just stacks up for you to build the stuff at the high end of the market. So if we're asking you to build the stuff at the low end of the market, we've really got to make it too good to be true. So the Housing Trust Fund is definitely a key tool for that. That's new for us here in Biddeford. We have $500,000 in it, which we got from a market rate project, and we are now, it's all dedicated to a 39-unit affordable housing project, which has not broken ground yet. We're hopeful that it will soon. And so I think that if I can follow on Kristina's building affordable housing is trying to get the family to come together for Thanksgiving dinner and get food on the table analogy. It's not the turkey, but it's the stuffing maybe. So it's that part of the capital stack to hopefully make this project make that much more sense, because I do think it's tough. I mean, the runway for these projects is pretty long, and we're seeing in our market a bit of still the last maybe of the COVID sugar high, where there's just intense demand. I mean, we're so blessed with the mill redevelopment, and I spoke to one of the developers there last week that's got a project in sort of in behind Rover Bagel, which is a great spot to go, right? And she had 28 showings for one market rate mill redevelopment project apartment, and people offering to pay, a year's rent up front and things like that. So that part of the market is really drawing developers, and so for us to draw them away, this tool is a key one, Rebeccah, and I hope that we can use it again and use it well to spur affordable housing in Biddeford, because I just want to close with this. This is just so absolutely key for us, that if we need housing for a nurse and a firefighter and a teacher so intensely. We'll be at the job fair. Maybe our school is there this week at the University of Maine in Farmington. We'll probably extend 8 or 10 offers to recently graduated teachers. That by contract, those jobs pay in the 40K range, a little bit below that. Wish we could fix that, but that's the way it is. And they will say to us, where am I going to live in Biddeford? And we might not be able to get those people to come teach in Biddeford, even though we desperately need them if we don't figure this out. So we're intensely dedicated to getting it right.
Thank you. So I want to move to Erin and Tori and talk about another really important part of moving housing forward is the conversation, elevating the conversation. As we know, the conversation of housing invokes a lot of different perspectives and feelings. Unfortunately, it does. We don't all feel the same way about it. And so I want to ask you, Tori and Erin, Tori, I know that Bridgeton has a housing study underway, and you're moving forward with some affordable housing development. And Erin and Yarmouth, you formed a housing committee that's focusing on the expansion of housing opportunities in the community. Tori, let's start with you. Can you talk a little bit about this work and how you started the conversation of housing in your community, and what are your hopes for the outcomes of this initiative?
Sure, thank you. So Bridgeton is one of the beneficiaries of the lovely Housing Opportunity Program that we've discussed quite a bit today. We're really grateful for GPCOG as they were applying for that grant program. They reached out and asked if we had any projects in mind, and we did. So we just finished a pretty robust community engagement program with our open space plan, which was mainly focused on conservation and recreation. We had about a 12% response rate from our community, which, our community is quite small, so we were proud of that. And it really had us taking a deep dive into our town-owned property and what might be the highest and best use for our town-owned property. So we have 3 town-owned parcels that are just outside of our downtown area. Each are pretty easily accessible to our brand new wastewater treatment facility. We just finished a $28 million treatment facility in Bridgeton, so that's been a huge driver for some of the growth that we've been experiencing. And we also just had a fiber build out in our downtown as well. So we have these 3 parcels. They're 13 acres, 16 acres, and 20 acres. 2 of those were used as leach fields for our previous wastewater system. So now that we've turned on our new treatment facility, we no longer need those. So GPCOG is helping us look at, do a feasibility study on those 3 parcels to see which might be better suited for a housing development. So we're really excited to work with them on that, and we're still kind of in the planning stages. But I can't stress enough the importance of that type of funding and those programs, because it is really difficult to start that conversation and bring that initiative forward as, a municipal employee or as a board. And so if someone can come in and say, hey, this is funded and we're going to do the study for you, it's a much easier sell in your community. And then you can present everyone with all of the information that they need, rather than starting with questions before you even get started. So we're really grateful for DECD and that program, and also GPCOG.
So Yarmouth's Affordable Housing Committee was appointed in December 2020, and for most of 2021 was in a listening and learning phase with the support of a Resilience Corps fellow from GPCOG, which she's now our assistant planner, so that worked out really well. But the committee released a report in January 2022 that outlined the housing need in Yarmouth, and issued recommendations to the council around zoning, funding, and management. Through 2022, the committee spent a lot of time figuring out what their next steps were. This is clearly a big topic, and there's lots of ways to approach this, and mostly all the things need to be done, but balanced with capacity and staff and volunteer hours. So we did finally set on a path, and we attempted to bring an inclusionary zoning amendment forward, which received a pretty cool reception from local decision makers. So looking at that in 2023, we set that aside in order to tackle the amendments that we're required to bring forward under LD 2003. With LD 2003, it allowed the staff and the committee and the planning board and the town council to start talking about those big zoning amendments, of course, within a context of having a mandate and a deadline. But we hadn't really talked about big zoning amendments like reducing our minimum lot size. We're one of those communities that Jeff showed in his map that has lots of restrictions. So we did get through that, which was great, by the deadline, which is even better. But we also used that energy generated by LD 2003 to advance a Yarmouth Housing Summit. We brought in our local decision makers, that's the town council, the planning board, our affordable housing committee, and the co-chairs of our comprehensive plan steering committee, because we're also working on that as well. To workshop ideas, come to consensus, and establish an action plan for success. With an energized council and having identified actions, even those that we already have in development, so we can get those early successes and those quick wins. And with key milestones, made the best use of our staff time and volunteer hours from our committee members. We're excited to move forward on this action plan, which is focused on zoning work and also overlapped with the actions that we've identified in our draft comprehensive plan, which we released to the community last week. So it's a lot of exciting stuff coming together in Yarmouth. We've also made strides in connecting economic development and housing with the support of the committee. We amended our 3 TIF districts to support housing investments, and we also established a local development corporation, which is, of course, an economic development initiative first, but can be an arm of the local government to move more nimbly than the municipality could on housing opportunities, especially those that relate to workforce housing and economic development initiatives that have been long-standing in Yarmouth. We also have a committee member, a former committee member, who recently established a local nonprofit, the Yarmouth Housing Collaborative, which has encouraged the town to move on feasibility studies for 4 town-owned properties, where we might be able to create housing opportunities and reduce the cost for potential development partners. That identification of focusing on town-owned land was also identified in that 2022 report that was released by the committee. So looking back on that report, the committee is proud of that report and continues to use it to guide their discussions and our decision-making. We continue to advocate for elements within that plan and are moving toward more specific conversations around funding and how to best leverage the existing funding that we have here, that we have in town to support those efforts. The funding element is an important piece of the committee's work. They've advocated long and hard for it and really trying to make the best use of the small amount of funding that Yarmouth has in the bank to be really supportive of housing opportunities. But really the most success has come by bringing our local decision makers into one room, allowing them to talk through the need and what makes sense for the community, and identifying next steps for everyone involved, staff, committee members, decision makers. It really does feel good to have that action plan completed and solidified to make that meaningful change in the community. And I just want to shout out to my friends from Yarmouth, current and former committee members, Margaret Downing and Jay Waterman, and Karen Ornstein, a council member, who have consistently pushed the staff and me to tackle these hard conversations in the community. Don't underestimate that volunteer power to get meaningful change completed in your communities. Thank you.
Thank you. So hearing from all of you, I think it reiterates the fact that housing requires a multi-pronged approach. You need to start the conversation, you need to solicit support, provide resources, facilitate development through zoning. All of these pieces have to come together to create housing. Housing will not build itself. But layering on top of that, I think the other lens that we have to look at is that you've had some successes at the local level. And what we often talk about is this a local problem? Is it a regional problem, or is it a state problem? And the answer is, it's all of the above. And so I have this thing called Housing Without Boundaries. I don't know if it's my thing, but I call it my thing. And it's about what do we do regionally to address this issue. We know, and there were stats put out there about how many housing units we need at the state level and in Greater Portland. We know that people are fluid. And so often when we go into towns, people say, is your housing going to serve the people in our town? And I say, what does that mean exactly? Because is it the person who lives there? Is it the person who works there? Is it the person who has a family member that they're taking care of there? Is it where they take their child? There's a lot of ways to define that. So housing is a regional problem. And what I want to ask you is, what are the ways that you could see working together to address the housing crisis? And what support does your community need from regional planning organizations and from the state to achieve this goal? And you have a captive audience because we have GPCOG here and we have Greg Payne. I'm just going to call him out. So please, I'd love to hear from a couple of you on that.
Go ahead, Jerre. Oh, wait a minute. You need this.
I'm all set.
You're all set?
Yeah.
Is that a strategy? Where is Greg Payne? Is he still here?
I see him.
All right, I want to publicly thank him, his team, and the governor for the work they've done to support the city of Portland addressing the unhoused challenge. Greg's been a good partner, so if you have the opportunity to work with him, if my comment serves as a reference, take it as such, because he does what he says he's going to do, and I appreciate it, and I know the staff at Portland does as well. Yeah, housing without boundaries is true, but we live where we live because we identify with that place. So I think our housing strategies have to take into account that there are differences between Yarmouth, Portland, Biddeford, and Westbrook. But it doesn't preclude us from working on a common platform through GPCOG on big ticket issues. Like LD 2003, I know GPCOG has done a lot of work with some of the municipalities trying to help them meet that standard. In Portland, we're fortunate because we have a fully developed planning staff, and we've been working on recode for quite some time. And the housing issue is sometimes defined by communities. For us, it's about neighborhoods, and those neighborhoods' identity is as firm and as concrete as if I was trying to draw a distinction between Freeport and Falmouth and Brunswick. So we're dealing with the same issue. The scale is a little bit different. So I think we can use common tools. I think the state should provide common incentives. And that's a challenge for state government. I've served there. Our inclination is to fix problems that are in front of us rather than to act as a supportive partner to allow municipalities to seek their own chart for success. So that'll be a balance that'll have to be struck as we move forward in answering the call to 2003. So I'm confident that Portland's on the right track for our community. And I'm hoping that the strategies we adopt in terms of density and public transportation as two sides of one coin may be open to full plagiarism by other communities if it meets their understanding of their needs as a community. So the resources have to be common. The data needs to be common. I did take note when Greg was saying all this data needs to be collected. I think the state is very good at aggregating data that we can all share. But I know this council, and I've tried very hard to say we all have a right to seek our own future as individual communities in answering this call. Home rule still means something. And whatever process we adopt collectively has to incorporate that Maine ethic. I mean, Massachusetts is a different creature. I don't know why we'd think about going to Massachusetts to solve our problems, but I guess it could happen. They might have a good idea. Although at one time my father talked to me about building the wall, I was getting very nervous, but then he explained to me he wanted a wall in Kittery, because he says nothing good comes north on 95. Nothing. So I declined his offer, and I told him I'd never been given a job with that kind of authority, and if I had, I'd have to break it to him that I couldn't do it. So I don't want to be in a position that we're competing with each other, but I think if we collaborate and willfully give up data to each other so we can make better informed decisions, then we benefit the region. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Mayor Dion. I'll take a whack at that, too. I'll start at the state level. I don't know if the governor's still here, but I think I heard her say she has extra money. I think all of us are in budget season, and it's particularly tough this year. We have the second highest valuation in York County now in Biddeford, which is truly remarkable. So we've had this incredible growth in the valuation of the city. It's almost doubled since 2019, so it's really, really remarkable, but it is just absolutely killing us on our school funding formula. Liz Cotter Schlax did a great, here, right? I mean, we really got to fix this. This is happening to Portland too in a huge way. We're the service center communities with all kinds of disadvantaged students. We have actually got 103 students in our department that are somehow housing insecure, so living in a car and things like that. So we're really being left behind on the way this works, and it's a big problem. You have some coastal properties that and some great in-town developments that really push up the valuation, and we want that. That's a good thing. It's funny how that is an average, and when we look at housing affordability, it's a median, right? So as an engineer, it's like the two numbers are different, right? So the joke is Bill Gates walks into a bar, right? The average income goes up by billions, but the median income just ticks up from 50 to 51, right? So and this valuation thing is a huge problem for us, and it's really hurting us. So we want to collaborate with our other service center communities that are facing this challenge to advocate for change around that.
Thank you so much for that. And I think that leads to my last question, and then I want to make sure that we have time for audience questions. This has come up a couple of times today, I think, because of the recent referendums, but there's a lot of stakeholders that have a vested interest in housing. And I would love to find a way to have a more diverse and productive discussion and inclusive discussion around the creation of housing. And so my question to you is, how do you ensure that those who need the housing or may benefit from a housing effort have an equitable voice and influence in the process, even though they may not be current residents of the town? So those that work in the town or own a business there, have a family member there that they're taking care of, or grew up there and want to move back, currently don't have an equitable voice. Do any of you have ideas or solutions or things that we can think about in changing the process?
God, I should keep my mouth shut. But here we go. I almost don't know how to answer the question because we have many committee meetings, we have public hearing. When I chair that, I'm always struck, and I don't know how my colleagues feel about this, how many individuals who are not Portland residents feel quite comfortable coming in to tell us what we should be doing. They're very comfortable. I kid you not. I mean, the amount of emails I get every day, many of them are not even residents. And they provide suggestions, critiques, and once in a while they say, hey, you're all doing a good job. All right, so I'm saying people that have a vested interest in the policy we're looking at, there might be some individuals who are not participating, that's always the case, but I can tell you, those who feel passionate don't feel intimidated by the process. And I happen to work with colleagues on a council. If there's ever been a council that's committed to inclusion, communication, and transparency, it's this group of outlaws. You know, I will say that. So I think they need to be there, not so much in the legislature. In the legislature, you don't get random citizens coming up to testify. It's usually somebody with a vested interest. But I think our capacity, and I don't suspect it's any different in any other municipality with their councils, is, I mean, I've spent hours in Hannaford and not bought anything, all right? And most of them live in West Falmouth, but they have a keen interest in the decisions that Portland makes. So, and I'm sure Jerre or the mayor in Westbrook has that issue, as does other communities. So I think if they want to participate, we've made it as open as possible.
I said, you know, we're trying hard, Rebeccah, thank you, and the mayor is right. We get lots of good feedback. A couple of things that we've done, we have a podium in the council chambers, which is intimidating sometimes, and so we did just add a wireless handheld mic, so you can testify from the chairs if that's more comfortable or if that's what works for you. Trying to draw that out. We've seen a good uptick, I think, in community participation. We actually have a budget committee hearing tonight, and I know as a counselor we had a couple where nobody's coming. Nobody showed up to say anything about our budget. I'm reliably told there'll be a lot of people there tonight, so I mean, it's hard to get right, though. I think a lot of us are working on this, right? Because the Zoom component is difficult. We've had real problems with that, with certainly people coming in over Zoom and saying really hateful things, and it's a lot of pressure on the mayor, I will say.
I want to thank you both for, you both took my hot seat questions, but I know that it's hard to create an inclusive process, and there is two sides to that story, right? And we're particularly talking about the underrepresented populations who have transportation barriers or technology barriers who can't get on Zoom, and how do you ensure that they have a voice when you're trying to pass a housing initiative? So I appreciate both of you providing those insights and the continued thought process in all of your municipalities about how do we create a better process and how do we strengthen the voices of those who are not being heard right now and encourage them to come to the table. So with that, I want to open it up. No questions? Okay. I know we're over time. So I thank you to all of the panelists today. Thank you for your time.
And I just want to also thank Rebeccah. I mean, she is doing such a great job at the helm of Avesta, and yeah.